Hello and welcome to Protect Life, back here at Breaking the Consensus. Tonight I'm delighted to be talking to Isabel Vaughan-Spruce. But before we get into that, I'd like just to remind you, you see the button there, the subscribe button. If you just click on that, any new material that we produce, you will be advised of that. In fact, also the donate button is there. Anything you can do at all, anything you can give to help us in the various battles that we are fighting would be really appreciated. But tonight we'll be joined by pro-life activist and a friend. You may have seen Father Sean Goff. We had a chat with some before, shall we say, a fellow combatant, a fellow fighter for the cause with Sean, Isabel, who has been at this stage twice arrested. So anyway, Isabel Vaughan-Spruce, sorry. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
So Isabel, can you just give a sense of the people out there, a sense of Isabel, who Isabel is, where you came from, sort of your bio, your background?
Sure, yeah. So I've been brought up a Christian. I'm a Catholic. I was brought up pro-life. In fact, I think that's kind of the default position for anyone, unless they're taught otherwise. I think even children naturally respect life unless they're kind of brainwashed into thinking otherwise, which often happens by society. So thankfully, I was brought up in a family that recognized the value of life. And I think maybe early on, even when I was younger, I used to enjoy reading stories about the Second World War or war stories generally, because I think it really brought out the best in people, obviously, as well as the worst. And I suppose naturally when you're reading, you often try and identify with people in the book, and you're thinking, what would I have done if I'd been in those situations? And frequently I would think that, even sort of subconsciously as I was reading through stories. And I think as I grew older, I began recognizing that it wasn't a case of what would I have done if I'd been alive then, but what am I going to do about the battle that is on now? Because, you know, as I recognize then, you know, that there is, if you like, almost a genocide happening now. There is a swathe of the population that is being treated as subhuman. And I think that was what got me started thinking, you know, I can't just kind of think, you know, if there was a situation, what would be my response? There is a situation, so what am I going to do? And I just happened to read a letter at some point in a magazine. It's actually a magazine called the Crusader magazine, a magazine that was actually started by Maximilian Kolbe, who was executed in the prison camps in Second World War. And he started this magazine many years before he was at Auschwitz. And the magazine's still going today, and I just happened to read a letter that someone had written into this magazine sharing about what they did outside abortion centres. And thankfully they left a phone number of someone to contact if you were interested in doing that kind of work. And I spoke to my sister and one of my brothers at the time, who also both shared similar views to me. And we agreed that we'd all like to go along and just pray outside this abortion centre. So that was just my first time there. And at that time, I hadn't sort of thought this is something that I'm going to be engaged in long term. It was almost just a case of I should do something, let's make that first step.
You said you were brought up in a family which was pro-life. How did that manifest itself? Were there discussions in the family at the tea table or whatever about what was going on in wider society? How did your parents communicate this? Were you getting this in school? I mean, did you go to a Catholic school, or was it only at home?
There was a bit of both, and so particularly my dad was very pro-life, and he would bring that up in everyday conversations, just naturally as things would come up, as we asked questions. He would respond and certainly would help us see what the current situation was. And he was somebody who, you know, would actively speak out against the culture if necessary, with love, with charity, but he certainly wasn't afraid to speak the truth. So I think that maybe kind of impacted me, you know, even from a young age. At school, it was very mixed. There was some parts of the school teaching, which certainly wasn't supportive of life. But I do remember I had one particular teacher who spoke very clearly on abortion as well, in a good way. So that sort of maybe helped reinforce the issue, which had been brought up in home.
So when you read this article in the Crusader and about this, and you read this letter, and you decided with a friend and with your sibling to do this. What age were you when you made that first decision?
So I had been in my 20s at this stage. So I just remember we all went on the train, because it was about an hour away from me, the nearest abortion centre. So thankfully, in a way, there's not any abortion centres near where I live. I'm sort of more in the country, and the nearest city was Birmingham, where there was an abortion centre. So we caught the train, and we were met at the train station by some people who had been praying outside the abortion centre for years and years. I always like to think with my pro-life work that I'm kind of standing on the shoulder of giants, people who've been doing pro-life work, you know, not just year in, year out, day in, day out. They were such, they've persevered so long in the pro-life movement. It's sometimes in very difficult situations, and they were such warm, friendly people. I remember them coming to the train station to meet us and making us feel so welcome, and very, very supportive towards us. And I remember standing outside that abortion centre for the very first time, and it was an abortion centre. It was actually the first abortion centre to open in the UK, and they did about 10,000 abortions every year at this abortion centre. And I remember having kind of mixed feelings. I felt, in one sense, there was this, I guess it felt really surreal. There was like a sense of disbelief when you looked at this building, which was a beautiful old building in a very expensive part of Birmingham, to look at this building and think every year 10,000 children are legally killed inside this building. It was hard to actually take that in. But then on another level, I actually felt a real sense of peace, clearly not with what was going on there, but just feeling that this was where I was meant to be. Now, I know some people who've said completely the opposite, that they go outside an abortion centre and it can make them actually feel sick. I mean, I know people, I know one lady I know who's been doing this work for decades, and she says every time she goes there, she actually physically feels sick. It's just so difficult for her to do it, but she doesn't let that stop her. But for myself, I actually felt really at peace. Clearly not with what was going on there, but just this is where I'm meant to be,
So can you just base what it was that you did? I mean, how did you manifest yourselves?
So at that point, there was a group that would meet there once a week on a Saturday and just pray together near the abortion centre. And there was one particular lady in the group who would be the one that would approach any women going into the abortion centre, just offer them a leaflet and ask if there was any help that we could offer. So at that stage for myself, I was just praying. So I'd have been praying with the group who were a little bit further away. We'd have been praying while somebody else would offer a leaflet and engage in conversation if somebody did want any support. And actually, I found that really helpful to start with, because I think it reinforced how important it was to pray. Because I think sometimes, maybe particularly maybe at that age, the idea is where the thought can be, what can I say to sort of change this person's mind, and that's not a good way to think about it. It's a case of, what options can I present to this person, if that's what they want, and praying for that person that they will meet those options with openness. So I think for a long time I was initially just praying, and when I say just, I think that's the most important thing, really. But obviously, praying and having a witness there. But after a while, on maybe to start with, just on days when this lady was away, I would be the one to step in and talk to women, obviously after having received advice on the things to say and how to start the conversation. And it was quite, sorry, carry on.
So at that time, Was there any legislation regarding standing outside clinics or abortion centres or safe spaces or anything like that? Or was this just something which was you could do without reflection?
So
Was it
this would have been
like,
about
okay,
20 years ago, and at that
mhm,
time we were very free to stand there. Occasionally we did get a police officer turning up, but not to have any concerns with what we were doing.
mhm,
You know, just maybe just checking on how things were or whatever. So no, we were free to stand there. We were free to have posters if we wanted them, and to, you know, have the leaflets that we want. No real restrictions at all, and it was all very peaceful, to be honest. I, we even ended up having quite a good relationship with the staff. It took quite a while to develop that. And I suppose, you know, understandably to start with, they were maybe, you know, concerned, did we judge them? Did we, you know, hate them? But I think after a while they began to realise that we weren't, you know, judging them as individuals. Obviously we don't like the work that they were doing.
sure.
But we developed good relationships with quite a few members of staff. I remember quite a few women telling me, who worked there, that they felt cursed. That was their words, not mine. But they also almost felt tied to their work and were finding it really difficult to separate themselves from that work and to get to step away. So it was appreciating how difficult it was for the staff as well. Often they started that work through maybe pressure in some way. I know maybe one man I spoke to who said he worked there because his mother and his sister did, but he hated the work, and thankfully he did end up leaving. And I remember as he left, he said to us, if I ever come back, it'll be to stand with you. So, you
Mhm.
know, we managed to build up relationships with some of the staff as well.
I mean, this is something you come across in the literature, isn't it? That people, uh, certainly, I want to pretend like it's a large majority of it, but many people who work in what we call the abortion industry, let's say, who over time find it increasingly difficult to deal with what they're doing and to integrate what they see in their work lives with themselves and with the rest of their lives.
This is so true. In fact, I remember when that abortion centre closed down, because that closed at the end of 2019, and the manageress came out of the abortion centre. It was December the 12th, which was an important feast day to many of the Catholics that prayed there. And she came and spoke to one man who was a very regular volunteer and had built up some good relationships with the staff. And she actually said to him that she was going to look for work in another area, as in a different type of work. And she said, when I started doing this work, I thought it would be for situations like rape. Obviously not from our perspective, that would still be wrong. But she was saying, I've just seen the same women coming back again and again and again, and I don't feel comfortable with it. You know, that was in essence what she was telling us. So I think she'd become quite disillusioned with the work that she was involved in.
I
Whereas from our,
suppose we know, I suppose, from experience, and sadly, with incredible speed, it's the same experience in Ireland now, that the speed at which you go from, oh, safe and rare, to being incredibly permissive, to now a proposal would be for there are proposals which may in fact become law, which would give Ireland one of the most permissive abortion regimes in the world. Uh, they sell the idea on the hard cases, but then the reality is very different indeed, and that seems to. So you start off, you're doing what you're doing. Occasionally, the odd policeman comes along to look at you to make sure you're not doing anything you shouldn't be doing. But then the law changes. And could you explain the legislation and what happened there?
yeah, so at the end of 2019, that abortion centre closed down, and so we moved to a different abortion centre at the beginning of 2020. And there was quite a different atmosphere. Maybe just because from a spiritual perspective, this place had largely gone unchallenged, even though it had been operating as an abortion centre for about 50 years. So I think that evil, if you like, had really infected the area. And while some people greeted us very warmly, there was quite a few people who very much opposed us. And they started writing letters, sharing these letters around the neighbourhood, saying things about us that weren't true. We then shared letters to tell what we were doing, and things became quite polarised. And on the back of that, some of the locals who did oppose us contacted the council, the police, and were asking them to bring in what's called a PSPO. Now, PSPOs are public space protection orders. I think they're getting a little bit more well known now, probably because of these issues to do with abortion centres. So formerly, they were used for things like drunken disorderly behaviour, for littering, for dog fouling, and local councils would use them in certain areas to deal with particular problems that were affecting neighbourhoods, usually to do with some sort of antisocial behaviour. But they then began to start using them to create what we call like buffer zones around abortion centres. So the first time this happened was in Ealing in London, and they created a zone around the abortion centre there, effectively where people couldn't, pro-life people couldn't go to offer help anymore. And some of these buffer zones or PSPO zones even labelled prayer or counselling as things that can't happen in the areas around abortion centres. And they're often sort of, I mean, the one in Birmingham is a good 100 metres or so from the abortion centre, that you can't go in that area to offer the help. And I think it's important for people to realise that PSPOs aren't like restraining orders. So they don't prevent people coming in the area. They don't say, Isabel, you can't go in that area, or you can't go near those houses or that property. It bans certain types of behaviour. And the behaviour it's banning is protesting to do with abortion. But as I say, crucially, it labels even prayer and counselling, you know, as forms of those protests, which can't happen in that area, and that's really concerning.
I mean, if I had the risk of sounding either stupid and or naive, unlike many countries, we live in a secular democracy. The United Kingdom is not a secular country. It has an established religion. The king now, it's very strange to say king, not queen, is the head of the church. And you're saying that you can break the law by standing and silently praying in a Christian country. You can be asked to move on.
In actual fact,
or am I misconstruing what they're saying?
Well, in actual fact, I don't believe that does break the law. That's why I felt it was acceptable for me to silently pray inside that buffer zone. I don't believe that my silent thoughts can ever be censored by law. And even as the law stands at the moment, I don't believe they do. But clearly it's labelling some forms of prayer as being banned in that area. And that in itself is outrageous, because prayer should never be labelled as some kind of protest or a weapon that needs to be banned. And even by the fact that they're doing that almost shows that they recognise the power of prayer, but prayer is always for good. You can't pray evil on somebody. The prayer that people are saying outside abortion centres is for the good of everybody. They're praying for good for those coming there, for those working there, for those in the neighbourhood. So to ban any kind of prayer is really concerning. But I do believe that to be able to think what we want is one of our most basic rights after our right to life. And I don't believe that any law can censor our thoughts, which is essentially what silent prayer is. It's our thoughts directed to God. And in actual fact, the fact that anyone should even consider that is what is happening is very discriminatory towards those of religious beliefs. It's saying you can think X, Y, Z, but if those thoughts are directed towards God, then somehow this becomes an offence.
Can you describe the first time you came to the attention of the police, shall we say? Can you describe what you were doing? What was happening? Describe the situation and how it evolved.
Yeah, so I run 40 Days for Life campaign in Birmingham. So the group that I originally mentioned that used to meet up on a Saturday, that changed into becoming a regular group that was coming together every 40 days for 40 days twice a year, and it became much more organized. So this 40 Days for Life campaign that I ran, this really grew. We got a lot more people joining to become part of the 40 Days for Life. And when the buffer zone came in, when this PSPO became implemented, we realized that obviously I didn't want my campaign to fall apart or to stop coming. So I decided that for that point, it was best for them to pray outside the buffer zone. But as I say, I did feel that my silent thoughts shouldn't be censored by anyone. I didn't believe that the law could prevent me from silently thinking what I wanted wherever I wanted. So on 4 occasions when the abortion centre was closed, I went inside this buffer zone and I went and stood outside the abortion centre and just silently prayed to God in my head. So as I say, each of those occasions last year, the abortion centre was actually shut, and I just silently said some prayers a few metres from the entrance of the abortion centre. I didn't engage in any conversation with anyone. I wasn't holding any posters. I didn't have any leaflets in my pocket. And I wasn't even manifesting that prayer. So I wasn't, for instance, I don't know, holding some rosary beads or a Bible or a cross. I was just simply praying in my head at that stage.
And then what happens? How did the police become involved?
So, well, as I was just standing there, I think the locals contacted the police and told them that I was standing there. So the police came, and to start with, they initially told me that I wasn't allowed in the buffer zone, and I explained to them what I have just said previously to yourself, that the buffer zone doesn't ban people, it bans certain types of behaviour. And I explained I wasn't protesting, which was what, you know, the buffer zone says isn't allowed outside the abortion centre. I mean, in fact, I've never protested outside abortion centres. So I made it clear I wasn't protesting. And at that point, they didn't arrest me. It was the next question which caused problems for them. They said, was I praying? And I said to them, I wasn't praying out loud, but I might have been silently praying. And that was at the point that they arrested me. I'd said I might be silently praying.
Sorry, can I interrupt you there, because
it's so crazy.
So I'm not putting this on as a rhetorical figure, but I'm genuinely, I don't know. I'm shocked, yes. I'm baffled. This is the United Kingdom. This is the home of the common law. This is, and the accreted freedoms since Magna Carta, etc., etc. And you're telling me a policeman asked you were you praying, and you said you might have been praying if you were your place, and on the basis that you might have been silently praying, an English policeman arrested you, and you're standing on the King's Highway in a public place where you had every right to be, and you were arrested for that. Listen, okay, here's not quite maybe to the point of the belief issue, but as a wider issue of legal issue. Are the civil liberty groups not outraged and horrified? Did you not get an avalanche of support from traditional liberal England that your right to stand silently you had been arrested for the possibility that you might have been silently praying? So did that happen? Did you get did the civil liberty, all the civil liberty groups and Amnesty, etc., just jump on the bandwagon and QCs turn up in taxis to help you out?
I guess there was two things. as you're maybe guessing yourself, those kind of groups, sadly, nothing. But the amount of support I did actually get was quite overwhelming, I have to be honest. I got a lot of people contacting me saying, I don't share your pro-life beliefs, but I'm really concerned that you've been arrested for your silent prayers, and I support your right to be able to do that. People saying, I'm not religious, but you should be allowed to pray wherever you want to. And I got many, many people around the world contacting me saying this, that they supported me. So whilst on one level it's hugely concerning that this should ever happen, you know, like you're saying, police officers thinking they've got a right to arrest somebody for their silent prayers, the fact that they searched me heavily on a public street, that they locked me in a cell for hours, that they, you know, interviewed me, asking me what I was thinking. And as
You were
other people,
thinking. Policemen asked you what you were thinking.
so I was under caution in an interview, and they asked me what I had been praying about. Clearly they know those prayers were silent, so this is asking me what my thoughts were. And I remember even repeating the question back to them, because I guess, like yourself, I was quite incredulous. Is this seriously what you want to know? What I was thinking, what I was praying about? Even even priests or vicars that I know don't ask me what my prayers are about. But yes, they said that's what they wanted to know. And whilst I
English
didn't
Catholics,
feel,
sorry, I may have mentioned this before at some stage. There's some on other, but there's a famous incident during the reign of Elizabeth I, where, as English Catholics are very well aware, there was a group of English Catholics called the recusants. They were kind of secretly Catholic or crypto Catholic, and they would pay their tithes, they would do the thing, but the recusants wouldn't go to church and would have to pay a fine. But there was a suspicion that some people were attending Easter and Christmas. They were doing what was the bare minimum, but in their hearts they were secretly still Catholic, and they're just showing up. And there was a suggestion made to Elizabeth that these people should go after these people. And she famously said, I have not a window to look into men's souls. So she said, the law can only be the basis of what people do, not what people think, not what people believe in their hearts. I have no window to look into men's souls. These policemen were opening a window to look into your soul. You weren't doing anything illegal, so they were trying to establish if you had been thinking or something illegal. So that was the first time. But you've been arrested twice, yeah? So what happened? So how does this? You're under caution. Do you go to court?
so I was released on bail, and then I got a letter saying that I was being charged on 4 counts of protesting and engaging in an act which was intimidating service users. And just to remind you, every time I'd been there at that stage, the abortion centre had been closed. So how I could possibly have intimidated any service users when there weren't any service users, it is mind-boggling, and it does beg the question, who's intimidating who? But I was then sent a letter saying that the Crown Prosecution Service were discontinuing the charges. Now, that's not the same as ceasing, you know, the matter. You know, I wasn't at that stage, I hadn't been found not guilty. So yes. I was almost left in limbo, because they also reserved the right to continue charges again at some point. And I realised on this letter that it did say that I also reserved the right to insist that the case goes to court. And I felt that was the only way that I would get some sort of resolution, to be, you know, to know whether the court were going to say I was guilty or not guilty. And I felt it was important to clear my name, because by this time, you know, the story of my arrest had been shared. You know, I think it was 6 million people watched the video within 24 hours. I wanted to make sure that they knew that what the outcome of this was, and it was, you know, it wasn't considered to be an offence to pray outside abortion centres. So I felt it was really important to go to court to sort of, as I say, get out of this limbo and clear my name. And as yourself and many of those who've watched your your videos will know that Father Sean was in a very similar position. So myself and Father Sean both then insisted that we should go to court, and it took a minute or so for my name to be cleared. They asked the prosecution what evidence they had. The prosecution said they offered no evidence at all. I was asked if I was guilty or not guilty, and obviously I said I was not guilty, and that was the end of it. I was pronounced not guilty. So I was completely acquitted.
You were acquitted. You're actually acquitted. It wasn't even struck out. You were acquitted.
Absolutely. So all four
chapter
charges.
2. But however, that's not the end of the process, because you're arrested a second time. What happens then?
This is where it gets really crazy, if it wasn't crazy enough to start with. Naturally, I would assume that the fact that I had just been found not guilty for silently praying outside the abortion centre, that the law understood that it was okay for me to silently pray outside the abortion centre. So a week or two later, I went and stood in exactly the same spot that I'd been in before, and again, silently prayed outside the abortion centre. And lo and behold, 6 police officers turned up in a police van and proceeded to arrest me again, to take me to the police station. 6 police officers
around. Well, in fairness, I'm looking at you. You look like a dangerous character. You obviously, I mean, I feel, I'm glad I'm not in the room there. You're a very threatening person. 6 police officers arrived in a van to take you off from your dangerous business of silently praying. Okay, so you're taken and you're detained. Are you cautioned? What happens?
So just to say that the police officers at that point actually told me my prayers were an offence. And when I explained to them that I didn't think my prayers could possibly be an offence, I reminded them the abortion centre was that I hadn't spoken to anyone, but they insisted and said, no, your prayers are an offence. And 3 times, in fact, they told me that. They took me to the police station. I was put in a cell for a while, and then I was released on bail, and I'm still on bail now. So I still don't know whether I'm going to be charged. I don't know what's going to happen next. But
no, obviously, do you have legal representation, or are you appearing pro se?
So an organisation called ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, they've been supporting me from a legal perspective throughout. So yeah, I've been really blessed with the support that I've received from ADF. So they're helping me from a legal perspective. But until I'm on bail until June, so really until the police to let me know whether they are going to charge me or not, it's a case of waiting and seeing what happens.
Presumably this will be dealt with in a magistrate's court, is that right?
If I was charged, then it goes to a magistrate's court, yes. But at the moment, I haven't been charged.
The reason I ask that is because whatever happens in a magistrate's court isn't going to establish or clarify what the legal situation really is. The United Kingdom does not have a written constitution, famously. However, if my memory serves correctly, the European Charter of Human Rights was incorporated into English law by Tony Blair's government. And do you think that ultimately this could end up going to what used to be the House of Lords, to the English Supreme Court, to clarify? On the face of it, it feels, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, it feels like this has to be a contravention of your basic rights. That this law, that a policeman can come to you and say, your prayers are an offence, has to be a contravention of your basic rights.
Well, as I say, at the moment, I haven't been charged. So it does depend whether they are going to charge me, or whether at the end of the 3 months of bail, they're going to say, actually, we haven't got an issue, off you go. But I think two really concerning things here. Even if they are to do that, the process becomes the punishment. So, yes. Other people are now going to be worried, well, even if I'm not going to be charged, I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to be put on bail for 3 months and to be treated like a criminal. So as I say, people will be wary of that. So, even if I was told that there was, I'm being released and not being charged, it's really concerning the fact that twice now I've been arrested, and other people have also had issues just from praying outside abortion centres, you know, being sent fines through the post and things like this. So that's one thing that's really concerning. And of course, the other thing is that now we've had national buffer zones voted in here, which will implement a very similar zone around every single abortion facility in the country. And that is a massive, massive concern. You know, are we going to see things like what's happened to myself happening on a national level? Are people just going to be left confused as to what they can and can't do? Because as it stands, it seems quite confusing as to what is or isn't allowed, certainly in the minds of many people. So I think we're in really concerning times.
Am I being excessively cynical to wonder if, in fact, from your perspective, the best thing is to use, in fact, as you said, the process as a punishment? Because maybe what they have actually no interest in clarifying what the status of the law actually is. But every time they force the people to go through this process, you're arrested, you're cautioned, you go on bail, you go to court, and then they drop the case every single time. So that, because if you were found guilty, we'll say, then you would be in a position to appeal that to a higher court and so on. And then they might actually get in a position where the status of this is actually clarified, which would either put them in a position of defending something indefensible or being told, no, I'm sorry, this is in contravention of natural justice and you can't do this. So in fact, in their, cynically, it may actually be in their best interest never to clarify this, to just arrest, caution, and then drop. So that, as you say, people, the process itself becomes a deterrent from people behaving like this.
I mean, that is a concern. And also, I think what I mentioned earlier, or at least sort of touched on, you know, the fact that the amount of times whenever, you know, stories about people praying outside abortion centres are reported in the mainstream news, so often we're accused of intimidating women, even though no evidence is ever shared to support that. In fact, you know, when they were looking at implementing this or bringing in this buffer zone, this PSPO in Birmingham, I remember going to the council and bringing along letters from women that we've supported over the years, women that we met outside the abortion centre, who wanted to show their concern at even the thought of a buffer zone, and how we had never intimidated them, and actually we had provided incredible help at a very, very difficult time. But nobody wanted to hear any of these letters. I wasn't even allowed to read one line of these letters. So, as I say, it's a case of who's intimidating who. We are being accused of intimidating women outside abortion centres to the extent that they're trying to bring in new laws to somehow sort of censor our behaviour, and yet we are the ones now being, you know, intimidated. In fact, this is the case all along. The amount of abuse that many pro-lifers experience when they are outside abortion centres trying to offer help, not from the people going into the abortion centres, but from people who live in the area or pass by the area. And we have certainly experienced that. You know, we've been spat at, we've been threatened, we've had our property stolen, we've had cars driving down the street at high speed towards us and veering away at the last second. You know, we've had physical abuse. You know, volunteers have been pushed into the hedge, and you know, countless things happening to us. As I say, not from women going into the abortion centre, but from people who live in the neighbourhood who are constantly accusing us of things that we don't do and wouldn't dream of doing. So I think
I don't, but you know, if they hate you and despise you and speak all kinds of calumnies against you, blessed are you, I suppose we might reflect. But have you received any support from members of Parliament or at all? Have you received, has anybody come up to speak on your behalf?
So before the national buffer zone was voted in, I did go to Westminster, and I met with some MPs there. And the MPs that I met with were very supportive. I was really touched, not just by how supportive they were, but how personally supportive they were. and you know, really took time to come and talk to me personally, and were absolutely lovely. But sadly, you know, as we know, it's the minority, and it was really tragic to see how many MPs voted for a national buffer zone.
So what next for you? What you're left at the moment? You're on bail in something of a limbo. What do you think is going to happen next?
So as you rightly say, at the moment I'm on bail, and the bail conditions. And initially, the bail conditions meant that I couldn't even pray outside the vigil, outside the buffer zone where my volunteers were forming a vigil. I wasn't allowed to go and join them, even though that wasn't inside the buffer zone. So that was my initial bail conditions. But my legal representation complained about that, and that has now been lifted just recently. But I'm still banned from entering the buffer zone for any reason at all. So I couldn't even, for instance, visit somebody.
Initially, one of your terms of bail was that you would not silently pray outside. That was a condition of bail, that you would not silently pray. That if you were caught on the Yorkshire moors silently praying, that you could have been held to be in breach of your bail conditions.
So just to clarify, they said certain roads that I wasn't allowed to go on, and these were outside the buffer zones, and this was where my volunteers were praying. And ironically, that those volunteers are now praying outside a Catholic church. Just that happens to be the spot that they've chosen to say their prayers. And it's just a group of 2 or 3 of them usually who are just standing there, as I say, just quietly saying some prayers. And like I say, I wasn't even allowed to go and stand there outside a church saying some prayers that's barely even in sight of the abortion centre. That's how restrictive it was. And yeah, that would have been breaking bail if I'd been found there.
I suppose to take a positive out of it, if we can, you say that you have received support, and maybe not from public figures, but a large amount of support from ordinary people who don't maybe share your convictions about the life issue, or are not religious people, but just who feel offended by the notion that you could be prosecuted for silent prayer. I mean, that must in some sense be heartening to feel that sense of that solidarity.
Very much so, yeah. It was hugely encouraging. And also, so since then, you know, we've had our 40 Days for Life campaign, for instance. That happened this Lent. So in the springtime, we run our 40 Days for Life. And as I explained, my volunteers would stand just outside the buffer zone. And I guess because of my, you know, recent second arrest, I was concerned how that would impact my campaign. You know, would people be worried about coming even outside the buffer zone and praying there, considering what had happened to myself? But we were, you know, blessed with many new people coming to join our campaign, students from the university saying they wanted to get involved, people coming to say to me, I've realized I need to kind of get off the couch now and do something, people who had maybe been passively pro-life, but recognized that it was important that they actually kind of stepped out of their comfort zone and put their beliefs into some sort of practice. So that was really heartening as well, to see that actually people were responding in a good way, and they weren't being, you know, frightened off by what was happening. And in fact, quite the opposite, that this was making them kind of step up and join and support. And I've had many people telling me that they've started going outside abortion centres now. It's just maybe motivated them to start thinking about the issue, or as I say, to get involved. So there's definitely been some really good, you know, results and consequences of this. And I suppose we often see that, don't we? That even at the most tragic and awful events, that good can happen. And I've certainly seen that here. I've seen a real sense of solidarity amongst some pro-lifers. You know, like I was saying earlier, you know, pro-life people from, you know, different countries around the world who've just got in touch and been incredibly supportive. So that has been really encouraging. And even the situation itself, the fact that the powers that be are trying to censor prayer, maybe as an indication and a reminder to us how powerful that prayer is. Because sometimes I guess, you know, everyone's tempted to sort of have those days when they're feeling a bit discouraged and a bit despondent about the work that they do. You know, I guess because I lead the campaign, I'm blessed to see the women that, you know, do change their mind. I keep in contact with them. I maybe connect more with them, but maybe for some of the people who are involved, who, you know, maybe don't see that directly, it could seem discouraging. But when something like this happens, it is a reminder that, you know, prayers really do work. That's why there is such a big backlash, even over our you know, most private and silent prayers, because they are incredibly powerful.
Just before we finish, I'd just like to ask just your opinion, and that's all. I'm not expecting you to be an oracle or anything, but just your own sense of this. There's been a lot of discussion in Ireland about how to respond to places, clinics or health centres or hospitals where abortions are carried out. For example, there's been a debate. Some people believe that in carrying signs or placards, for example, or using graphic images from abortions, and other people say no, we should be silent. Questions whether or not you should do it when the abortions are being carried out, or whether it's maybe more practical or politic to do it on days when they're closed. Do you have any? What do you've been doing this a long time, so you have a direct sense of, I suppose, both what is practical and what is effective, and how you need to go about this. Because as you said at the very beginning, I mean, it's important that it's done in compassion and in love. So what advice would you give to people who are thinking about how they should do it in Ireland when they're going about this?
Yeah, and I guess one of the things I would be wary of is sort of for me to particularly say to other people who possibly have different cultural kind of norms in other countries. Maybe certain things that happen in one country aren't always replicatable in the exact same way in another country. But for myself, something that I found was really helpful was working alongside post-abortive organisations. So I work very closely with an organisation called Rachel's Vineyard, which ministers to anyone, women, men, who've been hurt by abortion in any way, directly or indirectly. And talking to many of the people who've been through the help that's offered by Rachel's Vineyard, and shared their stories with me. And I think it's been really helpful to see how they see things. So for me to ask them, you know, what would have made a difference for you? How do you see, you know, when you see people, you know, doing these things outside abortion centres, what would you think would be the most helpful thing? So I think it is really good to talk to those people, people who have actually been in those situations. And we're blessed to have many, particularly many women who've been through abortions themselves, but have now got involved in our work outside the abortion centre. Some of them have had, you know, multiple abortions in the past, but have now managed to find some healing and some peace through ministries like Rachel's Vineyard and others like them. And so it's really helpful having them as part of the team. I'm always in awe of how important their place in the pro-life movement is. And I think that's something that will really make a difference, is the more that people who've had abortions get involved in the pro-life movement, this will really help things to change. I remember when abortion was really sadly voted in the referendum in Ireland, many people who voted for abortion were asked, why did you vote for abortion? And a lot of them said the reason that they voted was because of emotional stories that they heard. And I think on one level, it's really sad to think that people were just sort of voting something because of, you know, something just emotional. But it is important for us to recognise that we are emotional people. And actually, when we look at it, there's the stories that I hear from people who've been through abortions, they are heartbreaking. So many of them being pressured, being coerced, really not making any choice at all because there was no other viable option to them as far as they could see. So they didn't even feel there was a choice. These stories that are so emotional. And I think we need to share these stories more, stories of people who've been through that process, and can say firsthand, this didn't help me. Not only did it take the life of my child, but it really broke me as a person and disturbed my peace. And those are the people that we need to listen to and make sure that they get a voice. Those people who've been considering abortions and maybe at the last minute have had some help and changed their mind, and those that have been through the abortion process and know firsthand that it didn't help them, that
Okay, I
the
think
what they were told
that's
was a lie.
I think that's great advice, and I think that we would do well to consider that. And we're coming up in an hour, so I'm aware I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank people who have joined us tonight. Again, before you go, just hit up the subscribe button. If you can hit on the donate button, anything at all you can give us will be used uh, to our best of ability to protect and to advance those life causes that we all share, those values. But for tonight, I'd like to thank Isabel Vaughan-Spruce for joining us and to wish her the very, very best in the future. And maybe when things have moved on, we'll come back and have another chat to see when we know a little bit more of what has happened to Isabel, because I'm sure there are many more chapters that we are going to be interested in hearing. But for tonight, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on. Thank you.